Hello everybody and welcome to my Friday protection update. Now for the next couple of months we're going to be shining a very bright spotlight on the subject of trusts, kicking off next week with our Trusts Made Simple workshops. These are on Monday the 2nd of August, Wednesday the 4th of August, but due to popular demand I can now announce a third Trusts Made Simple workshop which will be held on Wednesday the 25th of August. Now I'm going to put a link to all three of these dates on the protection update because obviously it's not too late to register for next week's workshops or obviously the 25th of August. Now as the title suggests, we're going to take a practical look at how to get the job done for our clients in a straightforward, user-friendly and logical way. Now if you're wondering where the Protection Insight podcast is this week, there isn't one. But there is instead a blog article that I've written on the subject of trusts called Keeping Trusts Simple. And I've written that to kick this trust campaign off. So that's available both in audio and written form, and it's attached to this week's protection update. Now during the campaign and on these workshops specifically, we do have a few different providers along to demonstrate the process of writing a protection policy into trust using their trust proposition. That still leaves us though with some providers that you wouldn't normally get to see, and that's only because they're not attending the workshops. So with that in mind, I've actually been talking to all of them, and I've got many of them along to actually record Protection Insight podcasts where the objective is very simple. It's just show us how to write one of your protection policies into one of your trusts using our simple client case study scenario. That's a really simple objective, but I think these are going to be really useful as a resource going forward, because when we get to a stage where we've got a bank of these podcasts, you'll be able to dip in and out of them to check any of these out when you're writing a protection policy into trust with a certain provider for the first time. Hopefully, these podcasts will give you that little bit of reassurance and guidance about the process. So from next week, watch this space. Now, I don't want to steal too much thunder from Royal London. They will be presenting at the Trust Workshop next Wednesday. And also, I'll be recording a separate podcast with them next week. But quite timely, this week, they've just announced some changes to their trust proposition, which I think is amazing, actually. What do I mean by that? Well, we know that if you look across all the different protection providers, many of them do now have online trust processes, which are great. But generally speaking, they can only be used with new protection applications. That means if you've got a client with an existing policy, if the policy's already gone live, you'd need to then use a trust deed. Again, I'm talking generally speaking. We typically use discretionary trust deeds for protection business, and these are available from every single provider as PDF documents. Now, most of these are editable these days. The PDFs are editable, which means you can compose your trust on your computer. You can type it all up in terms of who the settler is, the trustees, the policy number and the beneficiary information. The stumbling block for me was that the last part, which is where you have to go and capture a wet signature on a trust form. Sometimes that can be a bit of a pain because it means you've got to print off the form, then you've got to go and get the wet signatures. You might have to send them out in the post and wait for the form to return. If you can imagine have to pick up the wet signatures for the settler, for the trustees, then some witnesses, you can see, whilst it's definitely not difficult or complicated, it could just take a little bit of time. Well, last year, and whilst we were getting used to lockdowns and social distancing, Royal London actually made a change to their trust deed PDFs, which basically removed the need for trustees to sign the trust deed. They also removed the need for any witnesses to sign. So all that was needed was the signature of the settler, or as they call it, the donor. Well, the change that they've introduced this week is that whilst they still require the signature of the donor, that signature can now be captured on the PDF digitally. What that effectively does is turns their PDF trust deeds into a kind of online trust. If you're an advisor that transacts business remotely, let me just outline how this could work for you. You compose the trust form for your client on your computer. You capture all the necessary information about the donor, the policy number, the trustees. Then you email it to the client. They sign it digitally on their computer without the need to actually print it off. The trustees don't need to sign it and it doesn't need to be witnessed. That means the process is complete. All you need to do is ask them to keep a copy in a safe place, send a copy to Royal London so they can note it on their system. It'd also be a good idea to send you a copy too as their advisor. I think that could speed up the process quite a bit, and it gives you a real fighting chance of really tackling any clients who already have protection policies in force, so you can contact them and start that conversation about why having a trust is so important. So as I say, they've actually applied that change to the most commonly used trust forms for personal protection as well as relevant life and business protection. Looks pretty good to me, and we'll get into more of that detail next week and also on the podcast that I record with them. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I've written a blog this week, and I read another blog this week in Cover Magazine from Alan Lakey, who is the director of CI Expert. I like Alan because he's an advisor himself. He was the one who saw that gap in the market several years ago about the need for a tool to evaluate critical illness policies, old and new, and that's when he came up with CI Expert. And he's always got something interesting to say. Well, in his blog this week, the theme is one which was close to my heart, which is value versus price. He questions the stance from some networks who have some really strict rules about certain types of advice and recommendation. And it's quite interesting really, because the examples he talks about are things which are really common. For example, the idea of recommending optional child cover if the couple doesn't actually have children at the moment. Of course, if you look at the quality critical illness cover providers, there are some covers which offer comprehensive pregnancy complications and cover for congenital conditions, which makes a lot of sense to add that valuable cover on for clients who are starting a family. He also looks at other issues that we all know make complete common sense, but he talks about it from the fact the Financial Ombudsman Service could take a completely different view in the event of a complaint, so the evidence and documentation is absolutely crucial. So another example he points out is where advisors recommend 2 single life policies rather than a joint life plan. We all know the cost is negligible, and what you're actually providing is double the cover and potentially double the payout. The last example I'll mention is the age-old conversation we all have about recommending level cover to protect a repayment mortgage. What's the difference in price between a DTA and an LTA policy? Well, it certainly isn't a lot, but technically you're over-insuring someone if the only need mentioned is that of repaying the mortgage. The common sense approach really is to explain why you've done what you've done, show the client the difference between each solution, and document this in your suitability letter. I thought it was an interesting blog from an advisor's point of view, and I'll add a link to this in this week's protection update. So that's it for me for another week. Have a great weekend, and I look forward to seeing many of you on the Trust Workshops next week.